Welcome back to another episode of the Happening Hoops podcast. I know last time we were still kind of trying to decide on a name. I think I might go with Happening Hoops Chat, but we'll Happening Hoops Chats, but we'll see kind of what ends up. We go what direction we end up going with the name. But this week, I am really excited to welcome on Rocco Miller of Bracketeer or the Bracketeer. Is that correct?
That works. Bracketeer.org.
Bracketeer.org. Yep.
Yeah.
Rocco is, for lack of a better term, a scheduling guru. I'm really excited to get to talk with him because scheduling is my favorite aspect of the sport. So thank you for coming on, Rocco.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Ethan. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to see you're starting up the podcast. Looking forward to, some of the interviews you have lined up. I know it's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So your website, bracketeer.org, obviously covers a lot of college basketball. Let's start with, how did you first get interested in college hoops and what inspired you to create your site?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to give you the cliff notes. It's a long story, but I grew up in the Seattle area and lived there for, first 28 years of my life. I've been down here in California the last decade or so, but the growing up in Seattle in my time was an unbelievable experience. So when I was a kid, the '89 Final Four came to town, and epic championship game went to overtime between Michigan and Seton Hall. Ramil Robinson and iced the game with free throws. Just a tremendous experience. As a little tyke, they had Sports Center being filmed at the mall, and Dick Vitale was, just becoming a broadcaster. He had coached Detroit Mercy in the '80s. And that was right when he was starting his broadcasting career. And they had these basketballs they were thrown into the crowd randomly. And they were all autographed by Dick Vitale. Anyway, Dick Vitale just came up and handed me one and randomly threw the other ones in the crowd. So anyway, just this weird moment where I was like, man, I love this sport so much. Even as just like, as far as back as I can remember, I was very, very young during that year. And then in '93, the regionals came back to the Kingdom, and we had the Fab Five, and it's a game that a lot of people forget about because Chris Webber called the timeout, and everybody talks about that in the championship game, same season. But that Elite Eight year, they were on the ropes against Temple. Temple basically had the game won at a few different points, but Michigan got a couple and ones in the final minute, forced overtime, and then, of course, ends up going to the Final Four. But that was just one of the best, even today, the best basketball games I've ever been at. And, of course, just a young guy back then. And then in 95, the Final Four came back with the O'Bannon led, Jim Herrick, Steve Lavin, the Lorenzo Romar, that whole UCLA staff who've gone on to be still involved in college basketball even now. And so just all those experiences in my childhood from a national level always had me interested in the landscape of college basketball. And our local team, Washington, was never that good most of the time. We had a couple good years, but I was always curious about national college basketball. And of course, in the late '90s, Joe Lunardi introduced this concept called bracketology.
Yep.
And so, I started looking at college basketball through the lens of bracketology probably around that time, or maybe a few years later, as we got into the 2000s. And during some of those selection shows, as we probably got towards like 08, 09, 2010, I was actually writing out my own bracket on scratch paper. We didn't even have Twitter till 2010, right? So all of that, was something I was very passionate about. And of course, I think Joe's brilliance, without maybe even knowing it, was it got a lot of people like me interested in watching like all 30 leagues or however many leagues there were back then. Now there's 32. But seeing the significance of it, you see a Cinderella team go to the Sweet 16. The next year, you're like, I got to watch that league all year. I don't want to be caught off guard by like, where did this team come from? So that's how I got into it nationally. And then as 2014, 15 came about, I thought it made a lot of sense and I was tweeting my bracketology updates by then. I've been doing that for about a decade now. It made sense to get it a little bit more organized, make it a very clean, easy place for people to digest information. I think there's a lot of things following bracketology on television that are not very educational. There's just a ton of assumptions and a lot of wiggle room. And so I've always been passionate about bringing education to the sport, because it's such an awesome sport. But there's so many myths and things about bracketology that just simply aren't the case when you study what the committee actually cares about and talks about. And so that's what I've always been driven by. And of course, all of the last few teams selected in or out, it always comes down a lot of times to their schedule. Like I knew this year Wake Forest had no chance of getting in with that schedule, and the fact that they didn't have a win on the road outside of the league against a team that was going to be in the field. And so, with that kind of background, I knew that, and I knew if Wake Forest would have scheduled a couple more games last year, that would have made all the difference in the world. And that's just a little example, but being involved in scheduling, I'm more passionate, I guess, from the onset each off season in helping the non-power teams. I have a great example. Longest time ever, St. Mary's never played anybody, and they thought they were fine. And so many times they got left at the altar.
They were an NIT team most years.
Exactly. So finally they started listing the last 2 years, and now they're putting together great schedules. This will be another good schedule they'll put out this year. So just things like that make me excited. And if I can be directly involved in a matchup, that's a great feeling. I try to take the emotion out of it, because it's really just coming from a standpoint of helping these coaches achieve their goals. And it's also fascinating to find out the entire formula for the off season. If you're a Power 5 team, there's not much to talk about. You'll get into a good MTE, multi-team event, and then you'll probably get a couple good home and homes, or maybe another big neutral showcase, and then you're just doing bye games. So there's not a bunch I can do for them. But if you're a Wake Forest, maybe at the lower or middle of the pack, and you're trying to make a statement, that's a team that I can work with. And then, of course, I'm working with the leagues like the A10, the American, the WCC, the Mountain West, SoCon, et cetera, those next batch, looking at who are those top 3 or 4 teams in each league. How do we get those teams talking to each other? How do we find the right date? How do we find an arena if it can't be a home and home? Those types of things are fun to work on. And it's also great whether it's directly or indirectly, when those matchups come together.
Yeah. And you talked about working with teams and leagues. What specifically do you do in terms of working with them to get opponents or get matchups or get events? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So ideally, I'll get an opportunity to work with a staff and sit down and see what that whole outline looks like. Unfortunately, that's just not possible time-wise with every single school. There's just too many. Even out of the ones that we, project or maybe pencil in as a possible at-large team, I try to meet it with as many of those as I can. Once I understand their outline, then it's becomes a lot more clear what's possible, what's not possible. Then I'm not wasting their time, and I'm not wasting another school's time, because that's not the point. The point is to try to find matchups that make sense and bring value. So that's what I'm focused on. In other cases, I'll just get texts from certain schools. Some schools just don't even want to get on the phone, and it's a lot harder to help them because everything's in a vacuum. It's just like, what do you have on December 10th? And I'm like, all right, I'll see what's out there, but I don't know what the rest of your schedule looks like. If I just throw opponents at you that don't fit, I'm wasting your time, you're wasting my time. So I'm trying to get better and better at that. It's a constant challenge, but overall, that's my foundation and purpose, and usually it's well received by each school I first get in contact with. And so for some of these schools, I've been working with them for 4 or 5 years. Other ones I'm still meeting for the first time, but it's cool. It just incrementally gets a little stronger each off season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for folks who I always kind of talk about it, because a lot of college basketball, I feel like news and happenings occur on Twitter. And for those of the, folks that aren't on Twitter, Rocco, I'd say, is one of the main handful of people who end up kind of breaking a lot of the scheduling news, I'd say, along with the D1 docket and John Rothstein. I mean, what is that like, kind of being regarded as one of the couple of people who distributes information to the masses?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I've really fully sat with that. I mean, the way I just explained the way I'm going about it is where my mind lives. I'm just focused on really trying to bring value to the programs. Because if I can't, then I feel like it's wasting all of our time. But I'm glad that there is value for the entire college hoops community and getting the information. And part of the purpose of putting it on Twitter as fast as I'm allowed to, like I'm always respectful of an event or a coach or whoever is putting the games together. If they don't want it out right away, that's fine. I mean, there's games that Ross team will put out that I've had for like 6 weeks. It's not the end of the world. But you know, I do want to get it out there as soon as I can, because I know I might only be talking to 3 or 4 people interested in a particular team, but there might be like 10 others. It helps those staffs move on with their next option. So it's great to kind of have a win-win there. Like, it's obviously diehard fans all over the country are thirsty for schedule news. Offseason can get boring, especially now that the portal's pretty much done. So they're relying on guys like me to get them the news. So I definitely understand that. And at the same time, it helps, like I said, these people trying to fill their schedule. You'd be surprised, Ethan, how many times a school will think they've got a game lined up, and then they go dark for a day, and next thing you know, a new game pops up and they're playing somebody else. So from that standpoint, I really want to get the information out.
Yeah, wow, that's just so fascinating to hear about, because I get, like, I think I understand a little bit of what you're talking about with that behind the scenes, because I go through that some in March with the postseason, where I'll hear, such and such team is wanting to participate in, say the CBI or the Basketball Classic CIT. And, I think back when I was first starting this out, like, earlier on, I've been doing it for about 5 years. In the early years, I would really had the strong desire to report it. And, I just wanted to get it out there and kind of get that credit. But then I think I realized, like, it's more about, like, trying to do it the right way and get the process right. And so I understand, but I can also see it from the fan side. I know, like, I think I've probably tweeted at you a few times, like, do you have any, local Baltimore area scheduling news? Because I'm also like that fan, and I want to know, who my team is playing, or the local teams, if there's good matchups coming to town. So it's just really interesting to hear about that process.
Yeah, and I'll add this. Like, I think it's probably obvious to you, but maybe just for the fans, maybe not understanding how scheduling works as well. There's a power structure to it, just like there is in the actual sport. So the reason, throughout the summer, I'll be releasing more and more league pages with schedules. So far, the top 3 leagues from last year are up. That's the Big 12, Big 10, and SEC. And then, you can probably predict the order from there. But that's literally how scheduling works. The top leagues have the most money. They'll buy whatever games they can buy a team, probably towards the bottom. We all saw Ohio State's schedule. They bought 6 teams that were in the 300s last year. But that's how the power structure works. Once they make their decisions, if you're a bottom of D1 team, like an Arkansas Pine Bluff or whoever it may be, you're looking for that biggest paycheck you can find.
Yeah.
Then they know if they don't land in a Big 10 team or an SEC team, maybe they'll go take that check from the Atlantic 10 or from the American or whatever makes sense next. They go through their progressions, right? So that's where scheduling starts and stops, is at the top. So once we start getting the outline of the top done, which is now we're getting to a really good place, you can see that all on the site now. We can really start honing in on, all right, who's left, what matchups make sense, and where do we go from here? So good example of that is San Diego State left a couple Saturdays open for the last 6 weeks. Enough big school potential opportunities fell through. They went ahead and did the deal this week to play St. Mary's on December 10th, right? Mm-hmm. But they would have, they would have preferred to maybe land an LSU or, a higher echelon team from their standpoint. Can't blame them. St. Mary's, same thing. Like, if St. Mary's is possibly going to play a home game with Harvard, but there's a chance they can go play San Diego State and Phoenix, they're not going to sign that Harvard deal until they know that, that's done. So there's just a lot of that going on. And with the portal, it's just extrapolated everything out. So you probably notice there's only 8 schedules released so far, or 7. That is a direct result of the portal. Usually by July 2nd, which is when we're talking here today, we'd be at 50, maybe 100 schedules out. But because the portal, there's so many events that are still not full. coaches reluctant to commit based on their own roster or potential opponents' rosters. And that if that's happening at the top, everybody below, for the most part, they're kind of stuck until those decisions get made, because their plan A is to play those teams.
Yeah, and I know, you kind of briefly mentioned it there too, but also for the viewers, like, these aren't just handshake agreements. Like, for every game that appears on a schedule, contracts have to be signed. And so, teams, as you mentioned, will maybe wait off on signing a contract with another team if they think that they can get a better opportunity.
That's correct. Yep. And there's just a constant, I call it musical chairs, because, they're like, yeah, we're still talking to them because if this doesn't work out, we'll get that deal done. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of second, third, fourth options on certain dates. But there's also, like, if you snooze, you lose situations too. Like a few neutral events I'm aware of, a team or two, I probably shouldn't say because it didn't happen, but let's just say a power team or two had the opportunity to play a game that would have helped them a lot. They sat on it for too long, and another team comes in and gets it. So there is an element of you snooze, you lose in this whole scheduling game, which is also pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and then just you were talking about, like, the high majors and filling up their schedules. With the increasing changing landscape because of conference realignment, like, I was talking to a buddy of mine last night, and we were saying, like, okay, the Big Ten now has, moving forward, is going to have USC and UCLA. Like, we could see them going to 24 conference games, and then you throw in a 3-team MTE for them as well. That gets up to 27, maybe 2 challenge games, one with the ACC, one with the Big East, and suddenly you're at 29 games, and it's 31 you can have on the schedule, and that only leaves 2 other openings. So a lot of these mid and low major schools rely on the money generated from the guarantee game or the buy game checks to fund their athletic departments. I'm thinking particularly on the lower end, some MEAC, SWAC, other kind of lower level leagues, the NEC, the Big West. And if some high major teams are only going to have 2 open slots, there's just not going to be enough games to go around for these schools to continue how they've been scheduling financially in order to sustain themselves moving forward. What do you see as kind of the future regarding Division I scheduling and that part of it?
It's a great question. I think as long as the NCAA is still in charge of the whole thing, they would need to, I think, because they do have more jurisdiction in basketball than, of course, football. They would need to put in some policies to not allow to go up to 24 league games. I know they let the Horizon do 22 last year. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a good precedent because I think a super conference like the Big Ten is becoming, or even the SEC, they'll probably capitalize and play as many as they can. The other thing you got to remember, though, too, is certain coaches in that league and certain ADs in that league might not be okay with that because, certainly the coaches, because they got to win a certain amount of games to keep their job. And that's another reason why a place like Minnesota, like I shared their schedule yesterday, a lot of commentary on, how low they went. But a lot of that has to do with, if you go 4-14 in the Big Ten or whatever, 5-15, you need like 9 or 10 wins to come in at 500 at the end.
Yeah.
If you start doing 24-game league schedules, fans are going to kill these coaches that are in the bottom. And they're, what are they going to do? Fire a coach and rehire a new one 1 year in? I mean, so there's got to be some sort of balance with that part of it, I think. But also, I think it would be tough for the sport and the committee if you have a power league playing up to 24 games, just because your metrics on non-conference strength of schedule become less valuable. If it's 7 out of 31 games, and okay, 2 of them are challenge games, so yeah, those are good. 5 of them are Q4. I mean, the committee already pretty much ignores Q4 games now, unless you lose, right? like Rutgers losing.
Northwestern usually drops 2 or 3 a year.
Right. Yeah, so you pay attention when they lose them, but if you win them, they basically just get ignored. In fact, we talk all the time in the mock committee, what's your record without Q4 games? Are you still over 500? So that's a thing. We get that directly from committee members. So Yeah, that would be the fascinating part. It's hard to predict. I can see like the the heavyweights of the league, your blue bloods at the top of those conferences, like Kentucky and the SEC, being totally cool with that. But I think I don't know. I think there's got to be a balance, because how do you compare? It's already hard enough. Like, it's already hard enough to compare the 8th place Big Ten team to the 3rd place WCC team, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you do that in the future, it's even harder. So, the most important property to the NCAA is the March Madness tournament. I think last year was what, $7 or $8 billion. That number is going to just keep going up. So they have to protect that with rules that are fair to everybody. Obviously, it's already completely swayed towards the power schools for bids. Perhaps that continues. Hopefully not, from my perspective. But I do think there's going to have to be some sort of balance. Otherwise, you can't just turn all the other leagues into one bid leagues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, obviously I don't have the answers. You don't have the answers. This is something that is still probably to be decided on what the eventual outcome will be. But I wonder if, we even expand the schedule and add like an extra 4 or 5 games so that people can get their quad 4 games. The low major schools can get their bye checks, but then these big leagues can also play more conference games and bring in more, television money. I don't know. I guess we'll wait and see what happens with that.
I think there's some concerns with expanding even further, because right now it's already the longest season in any college sport by far. It's like 5 months or more, especially if you make a run in the tournament. So I doubt that they're going to try to expand further. I mean, we used to start the season like in late November, if you go back to the 90s, or even early December. So it's already a month earlier than ever, and that's become normal now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they can keep pushing that. But I guess if it becomes more of a pro model, like obviously football is, and Power 5 basketball, Power 6 basketball is already there too. Who knows? I guess I can't say never.
Yeah. And, with these mid-major teams, I've noticed at least a massive shift, the past, maybe even just a couple of years, 2-3 years, to round robin events that include 3 or 4 teams taking place on one of those teams' campuses. For their MTEs. Like, I know this year there's a ton. There's, I think Pacific is hosting one, Navy's hosting one, App State's hosting one. Like, they're all over the place. And so in talking with these programs, because you're very plugged in with them, what do you see as the reason for more teams gravitating towards this, as opposed to, being maybe one of the visiting teams in an MTE that involves high majors?
Money, quite honestly. So there's a if you take your top 15 or so events, maybe 10 to 15, somewhere in there nationally, starting with Maui and Battle for Atlantis all the way down, there's only like 10 to 15 that pay really well. And so only a handful of mid-major schools are going to get into those. There's schools that really crushed it. ESPN does 3-year contracts, I know, with certain schools. So like Old Dominion, they'll be in an ESPN event every year for 3 straight years. So I think this is the 2nd year. Next year they'll be in a Diamond Head Classic, for example. So there's some sharp ADs that got in. Like Seattle U got into the Diamond Head this year. That's pretty awesome for them. So there's little examples like that. But once, for the majority of schools in that cluster, like the Pacifics of the world, they're then deciding, like, do we want to go pay to be in the Jamaica Classic, because that might they might charge us to be in it. There's a pendulum there where some of those next sets of MTEs, let's call them either tier 2 or tier 3, where you actually pay to be in it, and then it becomes a cost versus a revenue generating opportunity. So the like Pacific, for example, they'll host a newer style of event where it's basically just a cluster of home games, where Idaho will host 2 of them. Cal Poly, I think, hosts 1. Mount St. Mary's is on the road for all of them. That's becoming more popular. They've actually partnered with another company to help organize that. The company will bring more money to the table, make it easy for Pacific to just do their 3 home games, and then they're covered. That helps them get to their max 31 games, right? The 28 plus 3 model, and they're on their way. It's for them, like, I'm just assuming I didn't talk to Pacific's AD, but for them, it's like that makes more sense to us as a program than paying to go to the Bahamas or paying to go to, Florida Atlantic or something like that. So I think for each individual school, the decision making is so much different. Obviously, the lower majors are almost all looking to just get a check from somewhere else. They're not going to be able to host one themselves and generate revenue from it.
Yeah.
But a little bit bigger programs can. So it's worked well for Navy. I think Furman's done one. No, not Furman.
I know Delaware has done them in the past too.
Wofford. Well, Wofford was who I was thinking of. Yeah. So a lot of those now. And now it's driving even more schools. You saw Appalachian State roll one out yesterday. So again, I don't know that I'm old school, so I would rather just figure out more events where we get 18 brackets. The problem is, I work closely with events like the SoCal Challenge and others that do like Fort Myers is another one where they do like 4 power programs in the top bracket, 4 mid-majors in the second bracket, and all the coaches seem to align on that. And the organizers will tell me it's just so much harder to convince everybody to do an 18 bracket these days. And so
because the high majors, aren't going to want to end up with a Texas Rio Grande Valley that they could potentially lose, and then that would hurt their metrics.
Exactly. So it sucks for kind of the old souls like me, but at the same time, they're doing whatever they can to get everybody to their location, have a full day of games, 4 games in a day, and off they go. So that just seems to make sense for different events. And I know there's new MTEs coming in 23-24 that have not been announced that hopefully will help uptick the quality. Because the more of those we get where there's actually some juice and money behind it, whether it's ESPN or another big, well-funded organization, the better for everybody. Because then we can pull more teams up, and then there's less of the pool to try to divvy up into little 3 or 4 team MTEs. Which is what we're left with right now.
Yeah, and there's more events too, like recent ones that I know this year. I think there's a new one up in Montreal. That I don't know how many teams it is. There's one in Savannah too that popped up that is different from the one in Savannah a few years ago. So yeah, there's more and more each year.
There are, and when you get a field of teams like Savannah or Montreal. Because there are no power schools in either of those, but they have a lot of teams. Then you can do a good 8 to 10 team. It won't be a 10-team bracket. Savannah will have a 6-team bracket unless they find 2 more. Then they can do an 8, and then they have another one that will be a 4. So I don't know for sure. I haven't checked in, but I think the 4 will be the best 4 teams there in their view.
Though there are, I think there's 2 Valley teams. I know Valpo's in it and Evansville's in it. So you got to
they'll split
those up. And that's the thing too, with people changing conferences so much these days, these things are planned, a year or 2 out, and people change, and then suddenly they're 2 in the same conference that you got to deal with.
Yeah. And that happened with the PK 85. So with the PK 85, all those teams signed on 3 years ago. This thing's been planned since the last one. So they started working on it 5 years ago. And so, now you have UConn in the Big East. So Villanova and UConn are stuck in the same bracket.
Yeah.
Because there's another Big East team on the other side. So there's 3 Big East teams going there.
Yeah. Some of the MTEs too, it's a little bit of a different form, because you were talking about the Pacific one where for example, Mount St. Mary's is going on the road to each of those opponents. Right. But then if you look at the Navy one, which is only 3 teams, so it's not as great of a comparison, but all the teams are meeting in Annapolis and playing in those. So is there a distinction of when you're talking to teams, which format they prefer more? One, obviously, if you're a lower kind of team, involves more travel. The other, could involve playing consecutive days.
Yeah. So a lot of those types of ones, like the Mount St. Mary's example, got thrown together pretty early on in the process. I think they got theirs done in March. So they probably worked on it throughout the winter, and I'm less involved in the winter, to be honest. I pick all this up right after the Final Four. Then I go full force. But I think in general, your assumption's right. They figure out what makes sense for them. If Mount St. Mary's is coming cross country, they're also going to play at USC. So they're going to play 4 games out of here. And they'll just bounce all the way up the coast. And I think they'll probably finish in Idaho and then go home. But like the ones, the hosts, I think is the core of the question. Like for the hosts, does it make sense for them to host all these games on campus? Do they have the gym? Will anybody even show up if like Idaho's playing Cal Poly at Pacific? They kind of wait.
I know I would and you would, but
Yeah.
more than us too would people show up,
Yeah, and like a place like Winthrop is going to plan to host one in not this year, but in a year. They have a cool Rock Hill downtown arena where they had the racism event last year.
Oh yeah, I remember South Carolina was in that.
Yeah, in Florida State. Yep. So now they're working with the Rock Hill people to build something for next year. So like for them, it makes sense. Like we're doing all the games there. Winthrop's going to be the host this time. We're going to do it right. They weren't really the host, and they ended up playing like a non-D1 team last year. So it just depends. And again, it's all driven by those types of things are at the AD level, less than the coach level. The coach can have their say on which teams come, but on if they're going to host all the games back-to-back days, is that financially okay or not? That's like an AD decision. And so you need that balance, I guess. And in some cases, like, there's a couple companies that will just take a collection of teams and then try to send them all out. So I meet with them every once in a while, and like Pacific's involved with that company. And there's like, they have so many, there's like 10 or 11 of them all through these people. And that's nice for the coaches and the AD. So then they're doing most of the work and the contacting. So yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what their exact formula is. I think they just probably find out if they're willing to travel or not, or if they want something regional. You notice some of these have teams coming in from all over. Some of them are just very, very regional. Like Chattanooga last year had UNC Asheville and Tennessee Tech. I mean, they just took buses over and that was it. So yeah, they come in all shapes and sizes, and it's all dependent school by school.
Yeah. And then, just kind of one last question for you here. So back in the day, maybe 10-ish years ago, there used to be a lot more like mid-major specific kind of scheduling or events type of things. Like there was a 24-hour tip-off marathon, bracket busters, some challenges like the Mountain West Missouri Valley Challenge. I know recently Conference USA attempted to implement pod scheduling that was kind of the brainchild of Mark Adams from ESPN, who I've talked with a number of times, had on the old podcast a couple of times, but they didn't continue it after like a year or two. What innovative scheduling initiatives do you think that mid-majors can and should be working on to either get better quality games or more exposure?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a ton of wiggle room, unfortunately, but I know that, CBS rolled out a model where that's all being discussed behind the scenes for the future. Of course, won't be around this year, but those are the types of creative things that need to be discussed. I think what would help a lot as well is if there's something that happens, perhaps like in early February or that weekend that the Big 12 SEC happens, because if you can get a game or two in non-league that late in the year, and you can put your first place team against another first place team, at least, like let's say North Texas last year, who won and was an unbelievable regular season team with 10 true road wins. I personally feel like they should have been closer to getting in than what they actually were. Yeah. If North Texas could have played another first place team at the start of February, that data would have gone a long way, especially, if we're saying that they win that game. So I think stuff like that needs to try to get looked at and put together. I built a proposal actually in 2018 that I'll probably bring back up, maybe not this summer, but after another summer, which would be, I can't give the whole thing away, but I think the G League has done something amazing around the Christmas holiday, where they bring all of the teams in the league to Vegas. It's a 4-day event. Everybody plays twice with a day off in between, and it's just packed with scouts, and it's a TV event. If college basketball did that, that might be enough juice to get even the high majors to come to Vegas and do a showcase. Yeah. Everybody gets 2 games. and you basically you could pod the teams how you want to. I know there'd be a lot of politics in that. My idea is to do a true like seeding system. So, if Gonzaga is number 1 and UNC Greensboro is like number 128, we match them up, and then we put like the 2 teams in the middle together, and then we just bracket it all the way down. You just play your 2 games, make them mini MTEs, so winners play winners, losers play losers, and then you get your 2 games, and then it would be, again, like if we ever had a chief of scheduling in college basketball, which I would love to be his right-hand man. If we ever got
I think, frankly, you could be that guy.
I mean, that would be what I would do, but I know commissioners like Greg Sankey and others would not sign off on that. So we would have to rearrange the format a little bit because they would want high majors playing high majors.
Yeah.
But I think that would be awesome because if we're in this era where the best recruits are trying to delineate the G League, Ignite program, the Overtime Elite, NBL, all these other options. This would just be another feather for college basketball if we had a showcase event where it's just all scouts. You pick a time, even if we do it at the same time as the G League one, the scouts can all come at the same time, just pick 2 facilities in Vegas. I think it'd be genius. And I think it would be motivating for recruits to even more recruits to want to come play college basketball. Yeah. So that's another idea. And we can mix in the mid-majors that are good.
Absolutely. I know that there's been a little bit of on the fly scheduling, but it was more during the COVID time. Like there was the Bubbleville in Connecticut. And then kind of, I forget what time of year in the season it was last year, but I know it was last year that San Francisco and Loyola Chicago just met in Salt Lake. I know you were there. You might have even kind of put that game together. I don't know, but stuff like that. I know everybody kind of, people from myself all the way up to like Goodman and Rustin were like, yes, this is great. We want more of this in college basketball. And so, like me personally, I think maybe I'd love to see towards the end of conference play, if you take some of those, first or second place teams in these good leagues like the WCC and the Valley and the Mountain West and, the SoCon or whatever, and you kind of pair them up and just have them play and leave a couple of dates open, in February or something.
I agree. I think that's a must. And, the reality is, like I said, the Power 5 teams, most of them, especially your Ohio States, your Kentuckys, your Carolinas, now your UCLA, they're just going to look at this and be like, we don't need to do that. Like, what? Yeah, that's cute and all. We know a lot of fans would love it, but we don't need to do that. I'm North Carolina. I'm Duke. I don't need to go play that. So there's got to be some extra juice. That's why I think the scouting, make it a scouting event, would help lure them in. And if you got everybody else, maybe in the rest of those leagues committed, their hand might be forced. Otherwise, we could still put something like that together. You take, I like to call them the next 4, American A10, WCC, Mountain West, throw in Missouri Valley and SoCon and some of the other stronger leagues in the next tier. We'll do it with them and then show how successful that is to maybe recruit the Power 6 after that. But I do think we're only asking for 4 days and we're only giving you 2 games. So it's not like you have to go out of your way. It changes everything. It's not an earthquake. And again, you just count on hopefully those being both either Q1 or Q2 games. Be smart about how you pod teams. Don't put Air Force with Loyola Chicago because
that's a win could help Air Force, but Air Force is not going to get in the NCAA tournament, and a loss would knock Loyola Chicago out. Like I mean, this year you saw in the teams in Dayton, some of the last 4 in, like it was Wyoming, it was San Francisco, and at least for San Francisco, like I think I strongly believe that maybe without that Loyola Chicago game, granted I believe they lost, but I think without it. And the metrics boost that provided, I don't know if they would have gotten in. And like Wyoming, the Mountain West was historically good this year. And like I'd turn on the TV and every single game was like a gauntlet. You'd see like, San Diego State, Wyoming, and like Utah State, Boise State, and just Colorado State in there too. Like it was always a tough game down the stretch in the Mountain West there.
Yeah, the margins in that league were crazy small. Everything came down to the wire. It felt like the way Boise State won the league and like half their wins were by like 5 or less. I mean, it was a crazy unpredictable ride there, and nobody predicted Wyoming at the start of the year. So yeah, that league was pretty crazy to follow and cover. And you're right, like that stuff helps a lot. Like I do think San Francisco gets in without the Loyola Chicago game because they lost it, but all the other metrics came up, like strength of schedule, even the net. It helps you to lose a game close, in the middle of Utah like that. And I talked to both Drew Valentine and Todd Golden before the game and after the game, and we all agreed, like, nothing to lose here. Like this game helps everybody.
Yeah.
And it's cool, and stuff like that can come together. And that's what I'm most passionate about within this, because again, it all helps when leading up to Selection Sunday.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't need me to tell you, but as a fan and somebody who's around the sport a lot, I really appreciate the work you do and enjoy these schedules and these matchups that you're able to help put together. And thank you for coming on the podcast here. I really had a lot of fun talking about scheduling with you. I think we should do this definitely again, probably at some point closer to Selection Sunday. But thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ethan. Thanks for having me on anytime. And good luck with the show.
Thank you. That has been Rocco Miller of Bracketeer.org on this week's episode of the Happening Hoops podcast. Thank you for joining, and check us out next time.